This morning and for the next 2 months, we're going to turn away from the book of Romans, and I'm going to ask you instead to go back to a book that we had been studying for some time, and that's 1 Samuel. So I hope you'll take a Bible out and open it up to 1 Samuel chapter 21. If you are new to the Bible or you don't have one with you, there are red Bibles underneath the seat in front of you. 1 Samuel 21 is on page 279, if that's helpful to you, in those red Bibles. And I know that some of you will not have been with us as we walk through those first 20 chapters of 1 Samuel, but others of you, like me, just have a really bad memory. So I want to take just a moment and kind of catch us up to speed before we find our way back into 1 Samuel chapter 21. So 1 Samuel is the the of God's people, the Jewish people in the Old Testament, asking God to give them a king that was like the kings of all the nations that were around them. And so God gave them what they asked for. God gave them a man in King Saul who was physically impressive, but he was spiritually and emotionally weak. And because of his disobedience to God, Samuel goes to Saul, Samuel, God's prophet, goes to Saul, and he says to him, God has taken away the kingdom from you, and he's given it to someone better than you. And that someone was David, and Samuel anoints David to be that next king. But up to this point, David has just been faithfully serving King Saul. He's gone from being the person who played the music to being one of his generals who would go out and lead his men. But when Saul heard the people singing after David became a national hero by killing Goliath, that tall, great giant of a champion of the Philistines, the enemy of God's people. The people, King Saul heard them singing a song that Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands. And he became envious. He became jealous of that. And so not once but twice, he tries to kill David. David, he flees first to Samuel, and then he finds his way back to Saul's son Jonathan, who was his best friend. And Jonathan confirms for him ultimately that yes, King Saul is trying to kill you. And so we find here this parting at the end of chapter 20. And so the last part of the last verse of chapter 20 is in the Hebrew Bible, part of the first verse of chapter 21. So I want you to look back at just that last part of the last verse of chapter 20 with me as we read our text together. It says, and he rose, that's David, and departed. And Jonathan went into the city. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came to meet David, trembling, and said to him, why are you alone and no one with you? And David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has charged me with a matter and said to me, let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you. I've made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here. And the priest answered David, I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread if the young men have kept themselves from women. And David answered the priest, truly, women have been kept from us as always when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy? Now let me pause just for 1 second and explain that so that you don't think that women couldn't have bread, right? Or they shouldn't have been hanging out with women. What he's referencing, this bread that he's talking about, would have been bread that was placed on the altar. In the Old Testament, it's referred to as showbread. It's the bread that was there on the altar. It was consecrated to God. But we know this was on a Sabbath because that bread had been taken off the altar and replaced with fresh bread. And in Leviticus, there's an outline of what makes one appropriately holy to partake in such a situation. And one of those things was that you should not have had sexual intercourse recently in order to participate. And so that's the question that's going on in that situation. It says, so the priest gave him the holy bread. I'm starting in verse 6. The priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there, but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. Then David said to Ahimelech, then have you not here a spear or a sword at hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. And the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here. And David said, there is none like that. Give it to me. And David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him, and everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became commander over them, and there were with him about 400 men. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me. And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. This moment that we find David in is a difficult one. It's an unexpected one. David would have expected when Samuel showed up and he anointed him to be the next king, he would have expected something different from where he found himself at this time. He would have thought that he would be in a different place than running for his life. And that unexpectedness of that difficulty, we find him in this place, and we don't have to wonder about his mental state, because David writes 3 Psalms. 3 of the Psalms are about what he's going through in this time. Those Psalms are Psalm 32 and Psalm 52 and Psalm 56, and in them he describes his mental and emotional state. And he says about himself that he is afraid. He says that he is brokenhearted. He says that he is crushed in spirit, which means he is really depressed. It says that he is crying. This is the state that David is in at the beginning of this passage, and we can understand it, can't we? Have you been there before? Are you there now? If you're not, then you will be sometime. You will find yourself in a similar place to David, where you find yourself lonely. Those people that are closest to you are not able to solve the problems that you have. Maybe they're separated from you. David finds himself in a time of uncertainty. He would have expected when he was anointed king that there was going to be more of a straight line to the throne than what David's going to experience. That his path there would have been different, because surely if God wants him to do this, then he's going to make it easy for him to get there. And so he's asking the question, as many people do, I'm not sure why, God, this happened. And I'm not quite sure what to do. Now, there's a lesson that David learns, but I want to tell you up front that he doesn't learn it in the easiest way. The lesson that he learns by doing mostly the wrong thing. I've been there, right? You've probably been there. He learns an important lesson about himself and about his God by doing the wrong thing. And some of you have found yourself in times of unexpected difficulty, and you're not sure why God allowed that thing in your life. The loss of a loved one, or the loss of your health, the loss of a job. Whatever that might be, you find yourself in a place that you're not sure why God let that happen to you. And the lesson that David learned, again, we don't have to guess at it. That's what those 3 Psalms are there for us. The lesson that he learned is the lesson that I want us to learn. So I want you to look at Psalm 56. It'll be up on the screen for you. I want you to see as David wrestles with what he's going through and what he ultimately learns. He says, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts against me are for evil. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime, will they escape? In wrath, cast down the peoples, O God. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? What is the lesson that David learned? He says, this I know, that God is for me. So what I want you to hear this morning, what I want you to know is exactly that. When you're not sure why, I want you to know that God is for you. And I realize that for some of you, going through the trouble right now, going through the unexpected pain right now, that's a hard pill to swallow. It's hard for you to embrace the idea that somehow in this painful situation, for you, it's not an academic discussion. You're feeling it right now. And what David would say to you is that you can know that God is for you in this. When you find yourself in unexpected trouble, you're a victim of unfortunate circumstances, of illness, of policies and politicians or whatever. Such unexpected things, almost by definition, lead to uncertainty. Just by being unexpected, they lead to uncertainty. And our natural psychological response is one of 2 things: fight or flight. And when you can't fight, all you've got to do is flight, right? That's all that you can do. And that's what David does. As we look at the text, that's what we see that David does. It says in chapter 20, verse 42, where I started, it says he departed and came to Nob. Now, this is one of the very few things he does in this passage that makes sense. It makes sense that David would do this because Nob was that place where the tabernacle of God was at this time. That's why all the priests are there. And so it makes sense. It's 1.5 miles away from where he was. He flees there. He goes there and departs to there so that he might find help in this place. It makes sense. But the next time we see him departing, it's with a different tone. In chapter 21, verse 10, after he's been at Nob, it says, look at verse 10 of chapter 21, it says, David rose, and now he doesn't depart. It says he fled. When we hear that word, fled, there's fear wrapped up in that. There's a thoughtlessness in that. It's like when somebody frightens you and you just run, right? He's not thinking, he's just fleeing in that moment. He fled that day from Saul and went to, and this is why I say he's not thinking, he went to Achish, the king of Gath. Now, if you know your Old Testament at all, there's a decent chance that when you hear the name Gath, it means something to you. Because that was the hometown of Goliath, the giant, the champion of the Philistines, that David killed, executed him with his own sword. And now David leaves Nob and he's got Goliath's sword on his back. And as he goes into Goliath's hometown, this place where the last time the Philistines encountered David, he had killed 200 of them in one battle. I wonder, at any time did David think, maybe showing up with this reminder of who I am, maybe this isn't the best idea. But he flees to these people, the enemies of King Saul, the enemies of the Israelites, and perhaps what he was wanting was to be taken on as a mercenary. I'm not sure what he's thinking, but that's a possibility. He flees and he goes there and he's not thinking. Later he's going to say that when he leaves there, he escapes. Again, there's a desperation in it. I think probably what was in David's mind at the time was that old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Perhaps he's thinking that in Gath he's going to find people who also don't like King Saul. And so together they would somehow welcome him in. But it's a plan that David is not well thought out. He's not thinking clearly. He's just running. And he's running for the reason that he sees one of Saul's henchmen in Nob, a guy named Doeg the Edomite, which is interesting because Saul had defeated Edom, so perhaps Doeg had come with him at that time, but he saw him there, and he knew, he's going to say this in chapter 22, verse 22, he knew that what Doeg was going to do was go run and tell Saul. And it's interesting because it says that Doeg was there because he was detained before the Lord. This was not outside of God's will that he would be there. So what does he do? He grabs the only sword he can and he runs. He's tried to find shelter with Jonathan, with Samuel, now with Ahimelech, and everywhere he goes, Saul somehow reaches him. And I wonder if you can identify. I wonder if you felt that before. Like no matter which direction you turn, it just isn't working out. And surely that can't be God's will for me. Maybe you're there now. You're probably not running with your feet, but you're running in your heart. And your mind is running. And your spiritual walk with God, you're kind of running. Because you're disappointed with God, or you're telling God, I expected better of you. And so you find yourself running like David. You see, it feels like neither God nor those you trust are able to solve the problems that you are facing, and so you run. Now, before we see what David learns in a positive sense, I want you to see what he did wrong in this text. And so first I want us to see what is it like when we run in uncertainty? What are the kinds of things that we see that happen in David's life that might also happen in ours? When you look at chapter 21, verse 1 again, you're going to see that when David arrives at Nob, it says that Ahimelech, the priest, comes out to him and that he is trembling. And he asks him two questions. And those two questions sound like the same question, but David answers them separately. The two questions are this: why are you alone? And why is no one with you? Right? That sounds like the same question, but he's asking slightly different questions. Now, why is Ahimelech trembling? Before we get to his questions, why is he trembling? I think it's because Ahimelech is no fool. I think Ahimelech knows that for David, one of King Saul's generals, to be showing up dirty, sweaty, with no provisions, with no weapons, more or less alone, that something's up. something's wrong. And so it says that he's trembling. Now, David has two options in front of him. He can tell the truth. He can say, Ahimelech, here's the thing. Samuel anointed me to be the next king, and King Saul is jealous and he wants to kill me, and so I'm running for my life. But David would have known that when he told Ahimelech that Ahimelech would know that if he helped him at all, that would put his own life as forfeit before King Saul. He himself would be a traitor. So he can either tell the truth or he can lie. And that's what David does. And this is kind of a compliment. If anyone's ever told you you're a bad liar, in a way it's kind of a compliment. David's a bad liar. He's a very, very bad liar. I want you to look and see what he says essentially in verses 3 and 4. The two questions were, why are you alone and why is no one with you? And David's response is essentially this. He says, the king, he sent me on this secret mission. It reminds me of that guy in high school who always had a girlfriend who lived in Canada, Hey, he sent me on this secret mission. And I had to go so fast that he couldn't even give me any supplies. It's a little bit like when you catch a child, and they've got chocolate cake all over their face that they weren't supposed to eat. And you ask them why they did it, and they come up with a story and well, I didn't eat the cake. Somebody broke into the house, they ate the cake, and then they smeared it on my face before they ran out. No one would believe it. David is a bad liar. And I can't believe that Ahimelech is that completely naive that he doesn't see right through David's lie. And so that's what he does. And yet, Ahimelech helps him anyway. Now, some people believe that David isn't doing wrong in what he says to Ahimelech. They would say, number one possibility is they would say it isn't a lie. The king he's talking about is not King Saul, it's God that sent him on a mission. The problem I have with that view is there is no way that Ahimelech would have thought that that's what he meant when he said the king sent me on a mission. The other way that people deal with it, and they say, well, David's not wrong in doing this, is they'll say, yes, it was a lie, but it was a good lie. It's like those Hebrew midwives who lied and said, the Hebrew women just keep having these baby boys so fast that we can't kill them. Can't get you here soon enough to kill them, and so they lie. Or we look at people like Corrie ten Boom's family and we say, she lied, their family lied to protect these Jewish people from the Nazis that were there. And so they look at David and they say, well, it's a lie, but it's a good lie. The problem with that is David's only trying to save himself. David admits that he knew at the time, in chapter 22, verse 22, he knew at the time that he went and he saw Doeg the Edomite there, that Doeg was not only going to go back and tell King Saul, but King Saul was going to come and kill all of them. He knew that at the time, and he's going to take ownership. He's going to take guilt for that. What would have happened if David had been honest? Ahimelech, I have to believe, still would have helped him, but then David would have no guilt in what King Saul did next. When we find ourselves in unexpected troubles, instead of trusting that God has not abandoned us, what we often do is we stretch the truth. We omit certain details to protect the guilty. We put ourselves in the best possible light. And the result sometimes is like what we see here, is that in lying we hurt others. That's number one that I want you to see that happens because David chooses not to trust God. He hurts others with his lies. And I just want to say to us, if we have to lie to achieve the outcome that we're wanting, then we're not trusting God. There's no situation that we actually face that would, us telling a lie would lead to what God desired for us. And here's the thing that I want you to hear, perhaps more than anything else that I'm going to say this morning, especially if you're going through this right now, so many of God's blessings are wrapped up in uncertainty and pain. So many of the blessings of God, the way that we get to them are by going through difficulty. If I was to ask you, when in your life, if you've walked with the Lord for a long time, when in your life did you learn the most about God? If you were honest, you would say it was when you were going through that hard time, that you learned the most about God. So are there ways that you are deceiving others so that you can avoid the struggle of faith that God has put in front of you? Second, I want us to see that when we don't trust God in the uncertainty that we're going through, what we do is we hurt our testimony. We hurt our testimony. When David arrives in Gath, the very first thing he hears is the servants of King Achish mocking him. The song that they are singing, it had been number one on the charts in Israel for quite a while. They would sing it, and it even says they danced to it, so it had a good beat, all right? It may not sound like it to us, but the Israelites loved this song. The song went, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And they look at David. David arrives at Gath, and he's dirty, and he's sweaty, and he's out of breath, and he's more or less alone. He's got a sword too big for him to actually use. And they look at him, and they say, is this the king of the land? Is this the person that they were singing that song about? And they're mocking him. And it says to us that David realizes that, and he becomes afraid. They take this song and they sing it back to him and they mock him. It's like parents, when you're in the car, if you're my age anyway, but millennials you'll be able to identify too, it'll just be a different decade. You're in the car and you're with your kids, and you've got that song that you're so excited to play for your kids from the 80s or the 90s. You're so excited to play it for them, and you play it for them, and they make fun of you about it. That's the worst, isn't it? That's what they're doing here with this song about David. The last time they saw him, he was a very different man. He'd killed 200 of them in one battle. The first time they saw him, man, he was just a young man. And he took out their champion that the rest of the army was afraid of without armor, without a shield, without a sword. He just had one stone. Don't you think the Philistines feared David? Don't you think they feared David's God that did this for them? And now what's in front of them is this figure that's only worthy of mocking. And David knows it. Finally, he sees how poorly thought out this plan was. You ever been there? You got this plan in your head. You know, it's like maybe you're arguing with your wife and you're like, well, here's how I'm going to say this and it's just really going to win. And then you say it and you're like, uh-oh, that was the wrong thing to do, right? You know it as soon as it's coming out. That's what David's doing here. He arrives at Gath and says, bad plan. Bad plan. Look at verse 12 and 13. It says, and David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spit run down his beard. How different is this from the young man David? How different is it from the man we see in chapter 17, where David says to King Saul and all the rest of the army that's too afraid to deal with Goliath, he says, your servant, talking about himself, has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defiled the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistines. What a difference from that to a man who's acting insane because he's afraid. How different is that from the results of that first battle, where it says when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now David's running. How different is he now? And Achish sees him, and if his response wasn't so sad, it would be funny. Because maybe you can identify with Achish in this. Achish takes one look at David and he says, I've got enough crazy around here. I don't need any more. Get this guy out of here. So in that sense, David's plan works, but be careful. Just because something works doesn't mean it's God's will. Look how far David fell in their eyes. And with him, their fear of David's God. As Christians, those of us that are here that know Christ as our Lord and Savior, we need to have this sober thought in our mind that most of the people we interact with will never read the Bible. Most of the people we interact with, if they know that you're a Christian, their view of who your God is going to be based on how you respond in these situations. And I wonder how much the God they see and how I respond in those situations reflects the God that we see in the Bible. Some of you had the opportunity over the last week, because you've been telling me about it, many of you, you had the opportunity to go see the film A Great Awakening. It's about the first Great Awakening, which I think was the greatest of the Great Awakenings, but it doesn't matter. And it's about George Whitefield, who was there and the great preacher of the Great Awakening, or one of them, and the relationship that he and Ben Franklin had. And I didn't see the film, and you did, and you can tell me about it later, but Ben Franklin would love to go and hear Whitefield preach. And on one occasion, somebody saw him, and they knew that Franklin was no believer. He was no Christian. And they said to him, Mr. Franklin, do you really believe this? And Franklin responds, and he says, I know that he does. And I wonder if people would say that about us as we walk through these kinds of things. Do our actions testify that we believe our God is for us? A pastor and an author, his name's Frederick Buechner. Frederick Buechner said this once. He said, pain will either break you or it will break you open. It will either break you or it will break you open. What does that look like? Not that our pain would destroy us, not that it would destroy our faith, but that it would break us open and that it would humble us before God. God would be able to speak to us in our weakness. What does David tell us that he should have done when we look at those three Psalms? If I could boil it down to two things, I would say this. I would say, number one, David is saying what I should have done is I should have sought the Lord. That first thing that I want you to see is we should seek the Lord in our uncertainty. That's the lesson that he's communicating to us. If we begin with that first thing I told you, that whatever the uncertainty is that you're going through, that you would understand, even in that uncertainty, that God is for you, then I am able to face that uncertainty. And instead of running, instead of making up my own plan, instead of any of those kinds of things, I could instead just simply seek the Lord. Psalm 34, verses 4 and 5, David says, I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from my fears. Those who look to him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. This is just my guess, but I wonder if David wasn't thinking about what his face looked like as he was outside of Gath. Their faces shall never be ashamed. What will happen when we seek the Lord in our uncertainty? David says just a few verses below that, verse 8, he says, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good." When you seek the Lord, you will taste and see that the Lord is good. God will honor those who seek him. God will honor those who know that however big that uncertain problem is in front of you, God is bigger. In Luke chapter 11, Jesus says, "I tell you, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened." So first, seek the Lord. Secondly, trust the Lord in your uncertainty. Trust him. And that's hard. But David says in Psalm 56, verses 3 and 4, he says, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose words I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me?" Truly, why would God allow his people to go through uncertainty and pain if not for the fact that that's the place that we learn to seek him and trust him? And some of you would say, because you're actually going through it, I would just as soon not have the pain. I would just as soon not have the uncertainty. Thank you very much. But I want you to understand that of all the great things in the world, the greatest good that you could possess is none of those things that an uncertain world gives you. It is instead knowing God, being loved by God, experiencing the grace of God. That's why Paul says, all the best things in my life, I count all of those things as garbage compared to the surpassing worth of knowing Jesus Christ. Trust in the Lord in your uncertainty. We fear in our uncertainty only because we do not yet clearly see God. We do not yet clearly see what God is doing. And in what you do not see, that's why you must trust him. God has brought this into your life so that you would learn to trust him. What happens when we do? He goes on to say that instead of you running in fear, fear runs from you. Twice in Psalm 56, David says, "In God I trust. I shall not be afraid." In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. So when you're not sure why, the best I can say to you is wait faithfully to see what God will do. Wait faithfully to see what God will do. David finally does this at the end of our account. He takes his parents to Moab, that land of his great-grandmother Ruth, if you remember when we were walking through the book of Ruth. He takes his parents there for their own safety, for their own protection. And look at verse 3. It says, he said to the king of Moab. Now, Moab is also enemies of King Saul and Israel. But it says, he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and my mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me." Finally, he's seeking the Lord. Finally, he's learning the lesson that he wrote about in the psalm. And look at what God has already started to do. God's already started to build an army around him. Even before that, look at verse 2. It says, "And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became commander over them, and there were with him about 400 men. All of the broken, all of the indebted, all of the embittered against the world, the people that were not content with what the kings of the world could offer them, those people came and gathered around David and formed an army, even as people would gather around David's descendant, Jesus Christ. Those people that are broken, those people that are discontented with the things that the world can offer, they gathered around him. Many of you know of my love for Winston Churchill. We can be a little offended by this quote as Americans, but just a little. He once said, "You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." And I wonder if finally you're here this morning and you would say to yourself, in the uncertainty, I've chased after all the other things. I've tried it all the other ways. I'm like David. I've hurt people. I've hurt my testimony. I've been running in fear. Would you finally be ready to try what you haven't? Would you finally be ready to trust that God is for you? If you're here and you don't know Christ, what that might mean for you is this. I would say to you with a high level of certainty that if God has allowed unexpected trouble in your life, if He's allowed pain in your life and difficulty in your life, it is so that you would come to a place of humility. So that you would be not broken, God doesn't break you, but that you might be broken open. So that God would meet you there. Would you finally surrender control of your life and trust in Jesus Christ? There are going to be people here standing at the front. If that's something that you've never done, I hope you'll come and you'll talk to them. And for those of you that are here and you are my Christian brothers and sisters, I would say this as I close. How would we know that we can trust God? How would we know His goodness? How would we experience His blessings if not for these unexpected trials? It is there that we find them. And I pray this morning that you would not let whatever you're going through break you, that you might let it break you open. Would you trust Him? Would you taste and see that the Lord is good? Let's pray.